Prime Day es el 16 y 17 de julio. Con las ofertas épicas exclusivas para miembros Prime, recibe el reconocimiento que tanto mereces.
¡Wow! Gracias. Ni siquiera preparé un discurso. Quisiera agradecer a mi familia, que siempre necesita cosas. También a Sam, mi repartidor, por entregarme todas mis ofertas increíbles tan rápido. ¡Te adoro, Sam! ¡Mua!
Compra ofertas en electrónicos, hogar y más este Prime Day, del 16 al 17 de julio.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, big story going on overseas, kind of breaking through in the American media a little bit. So let's go over to the UK and get some international perspective on what is going on in China right now. We have another one of our great young voices, talents that we love to talk to so much from the UK. Noah Khogali, how are you, sir? Great to see you and appreciate your time.
Very well. How are you?
I'm very well. Let's start with some background, though, because somebody's going to be like, well, why are you going to the UK for China? This is a country that you know pretty well, though, isn't it, my friend?
Yeah, this is a country where I spent a significant amount of time growing up, and I really saw this modern Xi Jinping evolution into the China that kind of after the Thatcher years and the end of the 1900s that it started to modernize and liberalize. And I think we saw as a family firsthand how it started to descend again into this pretty rampant authoritarianism and really see the impact that especially technology had on the surveillance state and the way that the Chinese government was really in control of every part of your life.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because I know I have family that married into our family from Hong Kong, so we tended to focus on what happened in Hong Kong. People look at those sorts of things. What was it like in What was it like on mainland China? Because I think the Western media, we have these gaps of Tiananmen Square, COVID, whatever's happening now, and they missed that run up you're talking about with the rise of Xi Jinping and the surveillance state and modern China as we know it today in the year 2022. Bridge that gap for us a little bit as somebody that was kind of there for some of it, what was going on mainland China, because the truth of that stuff doesn't really get out to us because of the media controls, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what's really important to understand is that essentially the Western world decided that the way that it could influence China and it could create a China that could fully participate in Pax Americana, for example, was to essentially trade with it and develop with it. So that over time, the Chinese people grew so accustomed to those Western niceties that we have, that democracy and freedom and those tenets of the Western civilization essentially came with it. So loads of effort was put into essentially turning Shanghai, as a really good example, into this massively developing city. And you saw there's one side of the Bund which in the turn of the century was essentially just paddy fields that is now covered in stunning skyscrapers, beautiful lights. And if you were just to take a snapshot, looks absolutely magnificent. But the cost of that was genuine lies. Is the Chinese government realized really quickly that it was a lot more efficient for them to develop a city with no regard for the people in it and make it look fantastic for the rest of the world if they just abandoned principles of human rights and freedom. So you had scaffolding going up skyscrapers essentially made of bamboo, which as an image is incredible, but when you really think about it, it's pretty deeply terrifying. And that essentially encapsulates the attitude that they took. We're going to have these Western niceties, but go back to what they view, or what the party view, as the Chinese principles. And those principles are essentially the surveillance state. So everybody in China uses something called WeChat, and that is spread into other parts of the world. But it's essentially a warped form of WhatsApp, basically, that you can pay for things on. And you essentially use it as Facebook as well. But the Chinese government have their tentacles in all of it. And the owners of WeChat, I'm not sure exactly who they are, but they're essentially the Chinese government. So everything you pay for, everywhere you go, Xi Jinping has an eye on it all. And that was the price that the Chinese people paid for development. So you might find many of them thinking that's just how it is and that's how the rest of the world is. But they, in fact, have been really, they've sold their souls for something that was pitched to them as the Western dream.
Yeah, Noah Khogali joined us. Now, people are like, well, we want to know about the protest. This is what you got to know to get to the protest, though, because we always say on this program, one of our principles, things happen in a sequence. They don't happen in a vacuum. China, economically, we've had people in here talk about it. Like, they understand the demographics. They understand the birth rates they have. They understand their limitations. They're trying to get rich before the economic downturn hits, is what they're trying to do in a nutshell. All that human rights. But at the same time, let's be adults here. One of the reasons the Western world was okay with all of this was not just the stability. This is really big business because China has a 750 million strong workforce that is beholden to their government. That is a unique business opportunity to people who can get past their morals and the human rights of it. And that's the toxic brew that's really made what China is today as far as human rights and geopolitically goes, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a few different problems here for China. So what the first thing that is important to understand is not really a problem for China now, but now that the rest of the world has become aware of it, it could be, is that as China has essentially embarked on policy of debt trap diplomacy across Africa. So if we're going to view what's happened in the Middle East over the last century and investment, is probably a good way of putting it, investment in the Middle East and the control that comes with that. China have essentially got ahead of the rest of the world in doing that in Africa because they've realized that lots of the really fundamental, something like lithium, that is, you can find lots of it in Africa, and it's going to be incredibly important as we go towards electrification. China have essentially got hold of that and have many of these countries in debt trap diplomacy. So the rest of the world has suddenly become very quickly aware that they need to deal with this China problem, because in 50 years' time, it's going to be a hell of a lot bigger than it is now. And this is something that everybody suddenly tried to realize. So the walls have started to close in around China. Their authoritarian principles have got a bit shaky when dealing with economics. Their housing market struggled a fair amount. And over COVID, they've seen lots of people realize that cheap labor can be found out with China. It's not just some Chinese monopoly. So the economy is starting to struggle a little bit more. And they're essentially getting cut out of lots of Western democracies, which is where they got lots of their technology from. So there's a lot of issues here, which have essentially condensed themselves into what happened in Hong Kong, which I think everybody probably knows about, and that last Western glimmer of freedom in China essentially disappeared, and what's happened to the Uyghur Muslims. And the CCP basically going, look, we need to get rid of anybody that could be inside of these walls and pose a threat. And people have started to wake up to that, because it is a lot harder to hide what you're doing in 2022 than it was in 1989. And that's something I don't think they really appreciated, was that there is a bit more information coming in and out of China now than there was back then.
Prime Day es el 16 y 17 de julio. Con las ofertas épicas exclusivas para miembros Prime, recibe el reconocimiento que tanto mereces.
¡Wow! Gracias. Ni siquiera preparé un discurso. Quisiera agradecer a mi familia, que siempre necesita cosas. También a Sam, mi repartidor, por entregarme todas mis ofertas increíbles tan rápido. ¡Te adoro, Sam! ¡Mua!
Compra ofertas en electrónicos, hogar y más este Prime Day, del 16 al 17 de julio.
Yeah, Noah Khogali joining us. This is so important to understanding what we're going on. You just mentioned it. The policy of the ruling CCP in China, the Xi Jinping government, is the people in the government are one. The people in the government are China. There's no separation between those three things. You have lived there. You've been on the ground there. You have friends and family there. How they've tried to force that on the people. Officially, nobody's going to challenge that. How ingrained is that now in the Chinese people? Because we try to be very careful and say, okay, look, the Chinese government and Chinese people are two separate things. I don't know if you can give me a ratio or what, but just how ingrained is it and how much is it the people? Because I think that starts to get to where we're at with these protests, is where you start seeing some separation from the propaganda.
This is an incredibly hard question to answer, because people would be so terrified about telling you that they weren't on the side of the CCP. So you would get basically everybody silently nodding if you asked who here believes that the CCP are, the supreme rulers, and they wouldn't voice their concerns because essentially they would get disappeared. So it's incredibly tough. I think my feeling would be that I would have faith in humanity. I would hope that these people understand that what's going on is not necessarily right and can see through the very thin veneer that has been cast on them by the CCP. Again, you're not going to get an easy answer to that because you can't really do any proper polling. And if you go out on the street and ask somebody, they're going to think you're tricking them into some concentration camp in the north of China. So incredibly difficult. But I think when we deal with China, we still have to operate on the belief that it is innate human yearning to be free, and that those principles of goodness are universal. We still have to operate on that idea.
Yeah, Noah Khogali joining us. So is it fair to bring up this point then? Because I really want the Chinese people to be free. Like I want all people on earth to be free as much as possible. Because I love freedom. I'm an American. That's I want them to be free. Those of us in the West, especially in America, the UK, places like this, should we be careful putting the larger geopolitical narrative on these protests for that very reason, though? Because how much of this, I understand there's all this background, and I understand they're oppressed, but when it's something like the COVID restrictions, which is what they're really pushing back against now, plus things like living situations in the housing and the stuff we saw at Foxconn and all that, do we need to be careful making sure we don't take the protests for what they are right now and putting too big of, this is going to be the movement that topples the government? Because we've got a really bad record in the Western press of predicting those over the last 10, 20 years, don't we?
Yeah, I think if we're being honest, I think very, very few commentators would suggest that this was the thing that was going to topple Xi Jinping. He's had hard challenges, and I think he'll probably get through it. There'll be scars, but they will get through. They will get through it, unfortunately. What is interesting is whilst it has happened and it's been triggered by the COVID issue, the protest of that blank white piece of paper, and I would encourage anybody that's not seen those pictures to go and find them because they are incredibly, incredibly passionate.
Yeah, explain what that is for folks so they know real quick. Sorry to interrupt you, but explain what those are.
Lots of students have been holding up blank pieces of A4 paper, which essentially are designed to give across the message that they have no freedom of speech. So it's not just about the authoritarianism we've seen in regards to COVID. It's about the fact that people aren't allowed to speak about it. And that is the issue. That's something that I think that will be a longer term problem. So whilst COVID's the tip of the iceberg, or the thing that's the straw that's broken the camel's back here, this is going to be a longer term issue because the people of China are starting to realize, I think, that they're not being given a voice to talk about things, even something like the COVID response. So something really interesting here that's been picked up, especially over the past week or so with the Football World Cup happening, is the coverage in China is different to the coverage in the rest of the world. So what you're seeing is a 30-second or so delay on the TV coverage, which is very normal for China. We used to sit and watch the news. It used to randomly turn off at points. But a 30-second delay in which crowd shots are being replaced with individual shots of managers or players. And the guess is that what that is designed to not show people in crowds not wearing masks, because that would spark a debate about, well, do we all need to wear masks and is this all sensible? And that's something really interesting, which I think speaks to the larger issue here, is that the Chinese people are starting to realize that the zero COVID policy embarked on by the Chinese government is not something that's based in health data. It is purely something which is authoritarian and based in control. And that's the thing that they want to tackle. And that's the thing that students are starting to realize. So whilst this might not be the thing that breaks Xi Jinping's grip on China, it is a very, very important turning point where students, especially, and the young people, because they're the ones that are going to make the change, are starting to realize that their voice and their opinions are not allowed to be heard.
Yeah, Noah Khogali joining us. You're talking about those students. To go back to Tiananmen again, because that's the image most people in the West get as far as Chinese descent goes, and maybe the umbrella protests in Hong Kong. Those are kind of the ones that stick in the front of your mind. This is very early days to this. People forget now because they just remember the guy standing in front of the tank. There was months of build up to Tiananmen before it got crushed and knocked down. There's also just logistics because China is a massive cut. Like if they wanted to send the army to put this down, it'd probably take them 2 weeks to get them in place. Talk about a little bit of the timeline here, because this is nowhere near as massive as what Tiananmen was, but this is also way earlier than when we got to those images in Tiananmen. What do you expect the crackdown to be, the version of it's come, and even the people that are very pro-China are like, it's going to take a while for them to get their response together, how they want to handle this. What do you foresee happening in the next couple of weeks as far as the government response to this? Because they're going to respond.
Absolutely. So the general playbook that they will use is they won't go hard and fast straight away, because then you destroy the illusion that you're allowed to have a different opinion. If they walked in tomorrow and just obliterated the protests in some bloody and gruesome way, it would go down awfully, and that wouldn't work for them. So what I'd imagine they're going to do, and this is based on Tiananmen and Hong Kong, is they will wait for leaders, essentially, to pop up out of the students, and that's who they'll go for. And they'll show that if you stick your head above the parapet, then we'll come for you, and hope that that encourages everybody else to keep their head down. And that's the way they generally do things, is they try and avoid going for everybody all at once. They'll try and find individuals and ostracize them. So you saw that especially in Hong Kong recently. That's probably the best example, where they came for anybody whose name you would recognize. Nathan Law, for example, his personal favorite, somebody who was essentially became an idol of the public, and that runs very counter to the way that the CCP thinks everyone should work, because they think everybody should be this massive blob. So over the next few weeks, I would assume that anybody that steps forward out of this body to be a real, essentially the one with the loudspeaker over and over and over again, it'll be them that, or their family, that the CCP come for.
Yeah, we saw this. I'm glad you mentioned the Hong Kong thing, because we actually talked to a couple of the dissidents that were actually in those crowds. They were there for it. And that's what they said. They look, after about 3 or 4 weeks, they came out with a list. I think it was about 350 names. They took it, and the next day the streets were empty because there was nobody to organize. So it's very much the Hong Kong method that they have kind of perfected, for lack of a better term, as horrific as it is. Noah Khogali joining us. What does the West do here? Because obviously we're too economically entangled to completely put any kind of economic pressure on China. I would go back to the Cold War. It's undeniable that mass media in the form of radio and television had a cultural impact on the Soviet Union as it started to fall. It's inarguable that happened. You mentioned things like the World Cup. Is it something we should pay more attention to, the culture side of this, maybe more than the policy side? Because no matter how much they restrain the technology, some of this stuff must be getting through, or they wouldn't be throwing a fit about it, right? Is that something we should maybe be paying more immediate attention to?
Well, what I think is important here, so there's a couple different strands. I think it is key to understand what the major players in this, and the historical major players, are doing at the moment. So from a Times article in the UK a couple of days ago, it sounds like the US have started to open back channels, which seem to have closed with China again, because they're so scared of China aligning with Russia. So you can understand why they're doing that. But for somebody that is especially worried about the Chinese threat, that's concerning. The Germans have essentially taken the angle that the British did under Thatcher, which was essentially, we'll try and trade them out of this. And if we keep trading with them, then they'll just eventually turn Western, because that worked so well last time. And the French seem to think that there'll be a mediator between the Russians and the Ukrainians, because, again, that makes complete sense. Of course they would be. I hope the sarcasm is coming across there. When the British have essentially last night started using the word robust pragmatism. So you take from that what you will. It kind of runs in the face of each other, with robust being quite a strong, we're going to really take it to the CCP, take it to China, and then pragmatism kind of going the other way and suggesting it might be a bit more wet on it. So we'll see. There's lots of countries running different routes here, but what you hope is happening behind the scenes is this information war, because the Chinese are doing it here. So I'm not sure about the US, but in the UK, the Chinese have essentially this system where they are infiltrating universities and schools through teaching Chinese is what they suggest it is, but actually it's intelligence agents essentially coming over to the Western world and trying to convert people to the Chinese way of thinking. You'd hope that we are running something, if not slightly less James Bond-esque, that we are running information campaigns in China to hopefully ensure that people are realizing what's happening and break through that shell that the CCP want to be around China. And in the long term, that's probably what's going to have the greatest effect if we acknowledge that 1 billion people in China are going to need to be brought on side to really make fundamental change. So whilst it's important that publicly and in the international stage we talk big and talk strong about Taiwan and about these protests and about, for example, the BBC journalist that just a couple of days ago was assaulted by the Chinese police, and it's important that we all come together and talk big about that and really shine a light on it and talk tough. We don't pander to them. We also need to acknowledge how important the stuff behind the scenes is, and the more gritty side of international politics, where we are fighting a secret war, where there's no guns, but the bullets are information, and really hope that affects long-term change, and that in the long term, the Chinese people can overthrow the CCP. Because if we're going to affect something permanent, it's going to need the people's consent.
Yeah, Noah Khogali joining us from over in the UK. There's a very visible side of that information war that they're fighting, though. They are actively and systematically targeting dissidents and activists in Western countries. We saw the bomb threat call-in nonsense in London. We've seen them actually go outside the consulates and physically get into altercations with people. We know about the things like the Confucius Institutes in the States where they're infiltrating academia. We know that they're trying to, get their... They got themselves a port in Sri Lanka. They got an airport in Africa now. They're using all these other things. They're going to keep trying those methods, and they're visible right in front of us. How should we that have platforms in our social media, how should we be talking about that side of it? Because that's where we can talk about it, and the dissidents maybe can't, or the people in China can't. That's stuff we can see on our news feeds as long as we pay attention and find it. How important is it for people that have a voice to talk about those items and keep them going, because they do fall through the cracks of the major news cycle?
Yeah, it's incredibly important to keep talking about these things as much as possible, because it's very easy to get caught up in our own small, be it local or national politics, which are incredibly important. But then that's how these massive beasts of issues sneak up over 50 years and then are there and we can't deal with them. So it's incredibly important that we stay aware. But that should also, hopefully, in my opinion at least, lead to a public acceptance that some things might be slightly more expensive for us as nations, as the UK, as the US, but we need to do them anyway. So locking somebody like Huawei out of our 5G networks in the UK is probably, that's probably a more expensive option, or locking them out of nuclear development. Those are important things. And we need to be aware as a country that they're going to be more expensive if we do that, but that we need to. And people aren't going to believe that we need to if they don't know what's going on. So just for ourselves, as much as the people that are being subjugated on the other side of the world, it's incredibly important to stay aware and informed on.
Yeah, Noah Khogali, you just mentioned it. So let's take one of the elephants out of the room here. The CCP thinks very long. They don't have 5-year plans like the Russians used to do. They got 50-year plans. They plan ahead. They have their dictatorship in place. Xi Jinping just consolidated his power probably for life for all practical purposes here a couple of months ago. You in the UK, you're on your 3rd PM just this year. We change presidents every 4 to 8 years, and we change Congress every 2 years. They have a built-in advantage to their system. You talked about the different ways France has its own program. Germany has its own program. The UK. There's a real problem with coherency in Western democracies and democratic republics that are trying to counter them, just built into the cake, isn't there?
No, absolutely. And this is part of the issue, is that democracy is, for all its brilliance and as much as it is a moral good, is a way less effective of becoming some superpower than just being a dictatorship, because it means you can do whatever you want and it doesn't really matter what everyone thinks about it. So the Chinese are always going to have an advantage in that sense. So we've both got to operate on the rose-tinted glasses principle of democracy and freedom will come good in the end, but also look for something of a middle ground here. So we're quite lucky over here in the UK that it essentially seems that Labour and the Conservatives have essentially agree on most foreign policy. That's not always been the case, but that's where we are now. And that's something that we need to try and make sure that the entire Western world does come together on, whether that's through something like the UN or whether that's through something like NATO. We do need to bring people in the same direction on the same principles. And if they won't come, we need to convince them, because this, in the next 100 years, will be one of the most important developments that the world has ever seen. And there is a risk that because we are so obsessed, especially now, with these hot topics and these big arguments and these visceral politics, that we'll lose sight of what is really important in the long term. People really love hot takes and they go down really well on Twitter. But this is not a time for hot takes. This is a time for sensible politics where we go, look, there's a massive, scary problem coming over the horizon. Let's all deal with it together. This isn't a left or right issue. This is a future of humanity issue. And I don't say that lightly.
Yeah, Noah Khogali, you just brought up a great point that we need to discuss, though, is the way you get that, though, is you have to have leadership. Who does China see as the Western leadership? Because of Hong Kong and other things, the UK for, better part of 100 some years was kind of seen as the gateway there because they had that relationship. Obviously, the US since World War II has obviously dominated the Pacific in multiple ways. But who does China see as the leader of the West that they most have to deal with? Economically, it's probably America, but who are they seeing it from their point of view?
So this is something that's quite interesting in the Chinese psyche. Whilst we in the West will look at individual countries and go, Russia and China, they're the two big threats. The Chinese psyche and the psyche they've developed over the past 100 years, that they are the sleeping giant and they are better than everyone else, essentially means they don't think there is any leadership anywhere else. And this was the same mistake as the Russians made when they invaded Ukraine and thought that nobody was going to step up to the mark because the West is weak. China also thinks that. So this is, the soft underbelly of these dictatorships is they don't actually appreciate the fact that serious resolve can come out of democracies. And that's something that's going to be quite interesting to see play out. So whilst they'll understand that the US is incredibly important economically, in their mind, everybody else is entirely dependent on them. And their relations with Australia, for example, have kind of compounded that. But it will be interesting when the entire Western world, which has proved it can come together, does come together, what they'll be able to do. Because, again, they've been telling their own people for 50 years that the entire Western world is weak and limp and flaccid and it won't do anything. So when they do, it'll be very, very interesting to see how they react.
Yeah, Noah Khogali, like you just said, though, actions, not words. They tell their own people, they present the front, expanded military. We had that great picture about 3-4 weeks ago with Xi Jinping and his higher staff all in fatigues, which was really an odd kind of picture. This sort of projection of power, but their actions tell us what they're scared of. They are scared to death of social media. They are absolutely terrified of media infiltration in the culture. We already talked about it a little bit. Take it from that angle, though, is because they tell us what they're worried about with what they do. The modern technology scares the hell out of them, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And this is another thing that's a really odd two-sided coin here, is it's the technology which has allowed them to control their own people with such effectiveness. It is also the same thing that they are utterly terrified of. It is odd to me that when I'm talking to people in day-to-day life about what as a family our experience of China was, that they are still confused by the fact we couldn't get on Google. As something as basic as that, the only one we could use was Bing. And I don't know your personal opinions on Bing, but it was awful. And essentially, I just don't use that as principle now because the only reason it was available was because it bowed to the Chinese government. So we couldn't get on Bing, we couldn't watch the news, and you couldn't do any of these things because they were so scared of information. And that's the really, really interesting bit, is it's the information that they've used to establish their place in the world that they are so terrified of. And this is something where something like Elon Musk's satellites that he sent above Ukraine could be incredibly effective, because that is a way that you could bring information to China. And I'd imagine they would probably go and shoot it down. I'm not sure how you'd bring a satellite down, but you'd imagine that it would be an incredibly effective way of that information war happening, because that's where this is going to be fought. This is 1 billion people who are essentially not aware of what the other 8 billion people on this, or the other 7 billion people on this planet think and what they're doing. And that is something that we really need to focus on getting across. And we've got to find a way of doing that effectively.
Yeah, Noah Kigali, you just mentioned the billion people. That has been the secret sauce to everything economically and world power wise. Look, they got the numbers, and numbers mean something. Sometime in the spring, some people think it's already happened, depends on who you trust. Somewhere in here, India is going to surpass them in population with a much smaller economy. Just simple economic. They got a lot more room to growth, and they got more people to do it with. There's other demographic challenges coming from China. They're acutely aware of this. Yes, that they're in a closing window that they've got to try to get some stuff done. How does that calculus change what they're doing right now and show what they're doing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. This is in the same way as Putin has wanted to put a full stop at the end of his chapter in history. Today's China might see that chapter closing quite quickly and not want to end it with a comma where the next word is India. And India will always have advantages over China because it's part of the Commonwealth. It's had a long, long history of cooperation, even though at the moment, it's not viewed as a trusted partner, but it is a partner which is a lot closer to the Western world than China is. And it may be that hubris to want to put a full stop at the end of your name in history that is driving lots of this, and that breeds rashness, that breeds bad decisions, and that'll be something that I think when we look back on this and back on this period in history, especially, will be a massive lens to see lots of the actions of these dictators and why they're doing certain things. That will be really, really interesting to see in 50 or 100 years when hopefully we're all still here and nothing nuclear and grisly has happened.
Yeah, you mentioned the nuclear, so I've got to ask you. I know it's all projection, but everybody's worried about war with Taiwan. When they did that, I already mentioned it, the fatigue picture with Xi Jinping, which just looked absolutely ridiculous, but he did it. I'm actually I hope I'm right on this one. I was wrong about Russia, but I don't know that they really want an out-and-out invasion of Taiwan because it'd be really bad for business, and they are absolutely hyper-focused on the business side of it. They're seeing what's happening in Russia. I don't think they do it. I think they continue to exert pressure in other ways. Of course, they want to crush them and take them over, but I think they look at Russia and go, nope, it's like the old mob thing. If everybody's fighting, nobody's making money, right? I think the business side will keep them from that for right now. I think they'll saber rattle it. What's your feeling on it, though?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. What I would imagine is going to happen here is the Chinese are going to sit down and go, what's going to be more effective? Us actually invade Taiwan and give everyone else a reason to get, maybe not actually engage in conflict with us, or do we do this essentially underhanded and we just instill people that we want to run Taiwan in Taiwan, and that's the long term, and we still go, look, they're separate, we never invaded them, you can't get mad with us, but actually they control it. And the rest of the world, I think, will still need to respond really strongly to that, but it'll be a really good excuse for them not to. So whilst I'm incredibly concerned about that, if I was some dictator in China, that would be what I was doing, because it is way more effective. You don't then have to go to your people, go, all right, okay, who's going to fight for this country? Because that could end really badly. And the Western world doesn't then take the fight to you, or it has an excuse not to.
Yeah, Noah Kigali. I want to end this conversation with this because I threw a lot of hard stuff and you did great with it. But I want to end on this because I think it's the thing we don't focus enough on. Again, you live there. Talk for just a second about the Chinese people themselves. This is obviously one of the richest cultures in human history. They go back way further than most Western countries. There's a lot of good there. Put a human face on what the Chinese people are going through right now under this dictatorship and how we should view them separate from the Xi Jinpings and all the geopolitics. Just put a personal face on it for us.
Yeah, so what's a story is probably the best way of doing it. So I don't know how much people know about how Westerners live in Shanghai, for example, but essentially they're all living on compounds. And what you've got in these compounds is the very wealthy Chinese and all the Western expats. And just behind our compound, the second stint that we lived there was a really big tower block, which was, I never spoke to people that was in it, but it wasn't very wealthy, and it didn't look great. And I remember I flew back to the UK and flew back to Shanghai and went to the compound, and the tower block wasn't there anymore. And you knew in your heart of hearts that what had probably happened, which is somebody had gone, that doesn't look very nice, we're just going to demolish it, and essentially to hell with the people that were there. And I remember asking some people that were essentially supposed to be guarding or staffing the compound what had happened, and there was this sadness, but I don't know, it was never there. And you could really see that they did understand that something had happened and it was wrong and it was probably very evil. but that there was a risk to them and their family and their livelihood if they acknowledged it. And that's something, there's an incredible sadness there that is quite hard to get across, because you can't deal with your grief then, and you can't deal with the grief you're probably seeing quite regularly. And it is that kind of thing. Homelessness is never good to see, but you used to see it sometimes, and it would appear for 2 weeks, 2 months, in places where Westerners used to go, and then one day there would just be no homeless people anywhere, and everybody would act like it was just how it was. And again, there would just be this sadness, and then 6 months later, the homelessness would appear again, and then everyone would disappear, and then next time it would be all new people, and it was just a cycle where everybody knew that these people were disappearing, they were probably dying, but nobody could talk about it and could talk about how wrong it was. And that sadness, I think, is there in the Chinese people, that they can't deal with these things, that in their heart of hearts, and they may have never spoken to anybody about it, but they know that these things are wrong and these things are soul crushing. And yeah, it's devastating. But these people are good people. They are friendly. They are lovely. Their culture is rich, but they are just not allowed to act and to think and to speak like we would hope any person has an innate right to. And that's really, really hard to see. But you can still see the humanity and the goodness that is there when you look those people in the eye. They may not be able to say it, but you can see that goodness still there.
It's amazing to the Western mind to try to explain the fact that you can't acknowledge that a building is missing.
Yeah.
Like, how do you even put a Western mind around that and explain that to somebody? That's just such a paradigm shift from how we think, that you have to pretend like a building doesn't exist.
Yeah. And it's incredibly, incredibly odd. And you almost start second guessing yourself. Going, did I just imagine a really tall tower block there all that time? And there was just, and you don't know whether to live there all the time. You essentially have to enter this state of psychosis where you are tricking yourself into believing that it was never there in the first place. Obviously, why would the government lie to you? And that's weird to see. And it's not something that I think you can ever really understand unless you spend an extended amount of time there. But then when you do, and I remember when we left, lots of the things that we thought were normal, or tricked ourselves into thinking were normal. So accepting that your house was bugged, for example, and then you leave and you realize it's weird, but you can leave. And it's the people that can't leave that it's truly devastating for. And those are the people that I will always feel the worst for, because we can fight it and we can take the fight to it. But if they take the fight to it, it's their family that will suffer, and they will probably never see them again. And that's the bit that is genuinely crushing.
Yeah, Noah Khogali, is that the single biggest is that the single biggest obstacle to Western policy in China, is we don't understand that psychosis and that mindset?
I think so. I think as populations, we have become, which is odd with communication becoming so easy, we've become so insular. And these things that are happening in our own country are huge to us. So whether it's housing or whether it's energy and what is the cost of living, these things are incredibly important. But when it's something as basic as being able to think, we lose perspective because it's the other side of the world. And you'll get lots of people now in politics talking about, whether it's something like America First or focusing on Britain, but there is people on the other side of the world that aren't allowed to think. And we sometimes, and it's always hard because we're always going to vote with our own interests. But until you see that, it's really, really hard to appreciate how odd and how weird some of the rest of the world is.
Yeah, Noah Khogali, this was outstanding stuff, my friend. We'll definitely be talking about it more because this problem isn't going away. Let folks know where they can follow you, your writing, your other things you've been doing. You've been doing a lot of media hits too. We're going to link to all this. Let folks know where they can follow and keep up with you until they see you again back on Heard Tell, my friend.
Yeah, Twitter's probably the best place, at Noah Khogali. So NOAHKHOGALI. And then you'll get all the random musings and the random and the good media hits on there.
Yep. I'm going to get you back soon and talk again. Thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate the conversation. Noah Khogali, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good grief.
You're very deep.
I was hoping I just didn't sound
Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played.
Prime Day es el 16 y 17 de julio. Con las ofertas épicas exclusivas para miembros Prime, recibe el reconocimiento que tanto mereces.
¡Wow! Gracias. Ni siquiera preparé un discurso. Quisiera agradecer a mi familia, que siempre necesita cosas. También a Sam, mi repartidor, por entregarme todas mis ofertas increíbles tan rápido. ¡Te adoro, Sam! ¡Mua!
Compra ofertas en electrónicos, hogar y más este Prime Day, del 16 al 17 de julio.